Why don't I just go ahead? Well, it's 9:31 in the interest of time, and I think we do have a good group here. I just want to say it is my real honor and privilege to be able to introduce to you our keynote speaker today for Visualizing the Future Public Symposium, Jonathan O. Cain. I have known Jonathan since our days together at New York University Libraries, where for a little time we actually had adjacent cubicles in an emerging research space that was focused on providing data, GIS, and digital research support. So that was a long time ago, and I'm so pleased to let you know that Jonathan is now currently serving as the Associate University Librarian, Research and Learning at Columbia University Libraries. In this role, Jonathan is entrusted with supporting the library's strategic directions through providing leadership to the library's research support and teaching support, digital scholarship, and access units. Before joining Columbia University Libraries, Jonathan served as interim director of digital strategies and the head of data services at the University of Oregon Libraries. He also served as the government information librarian at the University of Oregon and as an assistant professor at Hunter College Libraries. Jonathan's library work focuses on providing access to digital education, educational technologies, and digital scholarship and scholarly communications. Outside of his work directly in libraries, Jonathan has lent his expertise to nonprofit organizations. He serves on the board of Code for Science and Society. Previously, he served on the board of directors of the Oregon Black Pioneers, and we are lucky to have him on our advisory board for Visualizing the Future. Jonathan holds an MS-LIS from Pratt Institute, an MA in Africana Studies from New York University, and a BS in Anthropology from the College of Charleston. And when we were considering ideas for this keynote, we all agreed we wanted someone to speak to our unique role within libraries as educators and what that means for our work. And so quite fittingly, the title for Jonathan's talk today is Visualizing a Future, Some Thoughts on the Library's Role in Data Education. So with that, please join me in giving a very warm virtual welcome to Jonathan O. Cain.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for an extremely warm welcome and for a bit of a pass down memory lane that's probably more extensive and more impactful than the sort of overview that I had for today. So again, thank you so much for inviting me here to share some of my thoughts about data education at this really impressive symposium. I want to thank the planning committee and the leadership of the project who are seeking to do something that I think is extremely important in equipping different communities with the skills and knowledge to be really impactful as frontline educators for so many communities who are often placed in disadvantaged positions when it comes to seeking and gaining access to the tools to participate in our digitized digital and data futures. My sincere appreciation to Justin, Angela, and Andy for extending this invitation and giving me this chance to talk. Over the course of today, I want to spend some time talking a little bit about myself, though I don't know if I can do it any better than Andy did already. But talk a little bit about my background and that sort of career path, and on some level why programs like Visualizing the Future were really impactful for me to getting to where I am, but also how this sort of trajectory has shaped my perspective on data education. And some of the critical issues that we're facing in higher education around data education and student success. I also want to really thank Angela for that land acknowledgement, and just also add that Manhattan is recognized as part of the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Lenni, Lenape, and Wappinger people. And I want to I recognize that before going any further. So Andy pointed out that I'm currently the Associate University Librarian for Research and Learning here at Columbia, and it's a very different perspective than I've had for about the past year. But the majority of my career, I've been working in public services as a frontline librarian or reference associate. And those sort of support capacities around education, research support, teaching, information literacy, whether it was at Hunter College, at NYU, or the University of Oregon, really shaped what I think data education is and what it could be. And I will just say that this is really a work in progress, and my thoughts are a work in progress. And I hope that over today, we will have some opportunities to discuss that. I think libraries have been an integral part of my career, and my career has been shaped a little bit by my sort of trajectory, but also really been shaped by a lot of where I grew up. Context is everything. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, where I think that libraries and educators played a really tangible role in the social history of that space. And I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge a couple of people who have influenced my ideas around program formation. People such as Septima Clark and the work that she did with citizenship schools, organizing education for social improvement, and Susan Dart Butler, who's probably a little less known, but maybe well known here amongst this library audience, and the direct causal relationship that her work did in founding Black free libraries in Charleston would have on the development of the Charleston Public Library System, a system that I benefited from greatly. So the role of the librarian and in creating spaces in libraries as social anchors to provide educational access as a tool for social change is something that has guided me in my profession in libraries, probably before I was even able to make that connection. But thinking about it, you'll probably see some of the legacy of that today as we talk about data education. So I did not come into libraries thinking that I would be a data librarian. I wasn't actually sure that I would even be a librarian. And this is why I think programs like Visualizing the future are really important. Most of my skills gained as a data librarian are self-taught or taught through extra curricular activities such as this program. My first role in information work came as an undergraduate intern at Avery Research Center as one of those education spaces in South Carolina that you hear a lot about being tied very heavily to social progress of the African community in Charleston in the low country of South Carolina. And I think this is one of the first places that I realized how socially impactful a library space could be, or an information space could be. I left the College of Charleston to pursue a master's degree in African Studies at NYU, where I started doing some modest work around statistics and demographics as I looked at Black populations in New York City in politics. What was interesting about that is that dabbling into the work really into the work of data and statistics piqued an interest for me, and also set the table, allowing me to actually transition into working in information spaces. I worked at NYU, as Andy pointed out, and at some point supporting eScience, but also data and research initiatives at a very early stage in that program before moving to Hunter College, where even though it wasn't a part of my job duties, I maintained a real active interest in ed tech and began working in digital scholarship, working with another librarian there to create the digital scholarship at Hunter College Libraries program in a really limited capacity. I left Hunter to become the government information librarian at the University of Oregon Libraries. And this is the role that really shaped how I would really approach data and data education, because it became something that was extremely important to my everyday work, and keyed me into the fact that for most of our folks, most people would need to have some sort of capacity to take advantage of all the information that was available to them that would be shaping their lives. So that really abbreviated career roadmap that brings me to data librarianship hopefully begins to set the table for some of my sort of perspectives on this question of our data society. It's become really apparent to me, both personally and professionally, that engaging with data competencies is critical for both career success for learners, as well as for social outcomes for whole communities. Engaging with the works of scholars such as Sophia Noble, Kathy O'Neill, Rua Benjamin, amongst many others, they highlight how data has tremendous impact on our lives and potentially some of the physical and psychological outcomes for communities. One of the more visible ways that this was driven home to me was a Twitter conversation in 2015. I imagine most of you have seen this conversation. I don't know. I'm like checking the chat and the gallery. Feel free to put comments in as we go along. Seeing the start of this Twitter conversation about Google Photos, and it illustrated to me some of the potential harms that a lack of diverse access to the platforms that are increasingly dictating a lot of our social and professional lives can have on individuals and communities. And it also hinted at some of the larger issues that we needed to confront. We all probably see on the surface level of this tweet where Google tagged Black people as gorillas. And I'm certain we can identify the first level of harm that is done in that work. But the subsequent conversations that this Twitter thread opened up highlighted some of the equally problematic and entrenched issues that made this a possibility. And so one person in this conversation pointed out that this is one of the things that happens when you don't have a sizable or any real sizable population of people of color in your engineering teams or your quality control teams for these sort of products. And so that led me to beg the actual question, why aren't there more people of color in these teams? There's no secret that there's a diversity problem in tech and in the big platform companies that are shaping our world. If you just do a really cursory level search about data science education, you'll see tons of results illustrating how there are plenty of scholars, technologists, and public intellectuals noting that women, Black, and Latinx communities, amongst others, are critically underrepresented in the careers that are touted as the most desirable and most impactful for students. And this is a problem for a variety of reasons. Aside from the financial and status implications that are associated with technological careers or technology careers, there are broader implications that affect communities in really unique ways. I was drawn to think about the work that Richard Newman did in writing about early information technology in the form of the printing press, and the parallels that it has to data-related tools and competencies. So he writes, for many Black activists, creating autonomous voices in print was a key step to liberating people of African descent from framing devices and stereotypes of imperial writers. So this is illustrative, of the impact in identity creation and self-determination that has lasting impacts on marginalized communities, equity-deserving communities. And this applies as well to data, people who are seeking access to data and data platforms, especially as they become more prevalent, if not more visible, in the tools that shape our society. The first example that I am always struck with, it comes from a 2016 investigation from ProPublica that is looking at the way that algorithms are used in our criminal justice system, from everything from sentencing to setting bail amounts, or even determining whether people are at a substantial risk to reoffend once they're in the criminal justice system. And this study found that Blacks were more likely to be rated as high risk, and even when the data would bear out that that was not actually the case by a substantial margin. And so as they dug into it, it realized that there were all these narratives that were being constructed around what it meant to be likely to be have a high potential of reoffending or offending while on bail, that were actually just sort of stand-ins for other factors of people's lives, such as employment, or the neighborhood that one lives in, the economic level of that neighborhood, or the crime level of that neighborhood. And there was no real interrogation of what that actually meant to certain communities. In a society where race is often coded, is often heavily associated with wealth, that makes a pronounced bias and an untrue representation of that community. Additionally, the tools are being leveraged in our schools as well. And we've seen some positive, what we are assuming are really positive outcomes associated with putting these statistical analytic tools in advising. They've seen improved grades and graduation rates for at-risk students. They've seen increased enrollment and completion of STEM programs for minoritized communities. And these are all things that higher ed has been striving to accomplish. But the ECAR study of undergraduate students in information technology also points out there are some potential negative impacts. And the story that is highlighted is one of them, right? There can be often false positives, data errors that are baked into the system that is concentrating on metrics and not necessarily on what a student envisions as success for themselves. It takes a lot of shortcuts and may move students into less rewarding or less challenging tracks because of some of the details of their lives that are outside of their performance inside the classroom or the people who have come before them. So it becomes really important to have these diverse experiences in that space to reshape these narratives, give that control about who these communities are back to these communities. And so this gets to the question of, we know that there is a problem with representation, but why is there a problem with representation? In this initial conversation, and a lot of my reading turned to the question of a problem of a pipeline, i.e. there's a reason, the reason that there's such a deficit of representative voices at the table in the creation of these platforms that dictate a lot about our lives and our society is largely because there just weren't enough people in those communities that had the relevant skills. There's a lot of problems with that, and we'll dive into that a little bit later. But I want to stress how I think how impactful or how prevalent this conversation was. And I will put my hand up and say how impactful, as I was beginning to be a program developer, this position was. So the idea that as a result there was a problem in the pipeline meant, and initial approaches to solving the representation issue, there was no shortage of programs that were designed with this being the chief area of focus, to bringing in underrepresented communities, whether they're Black, Latinx, women, or a myriad of other groups. into the technical roles that drive these technology companies. Companies such as Google, for example, but plenty of others designed programs that were initiated from the industry perspective to bring underrepresented talent from campuses to Silicon Valley companies. Programs like the one that focused on a partnership between Google and historically Black colleges and universities like Howard were seen as a key process that would prepare students for careers in tech. Programs focused on restructuring curriculum and HBCUs to be in line with the needs of Silicon Valley firms and moving from a holistic theoretical approach to data engineering to a more job-focused work. In an illuminating Washington Post article, it really explored a number of these issues and spoke with April Curley, a recruiter who was working at Google at the time that some of these diversity and recruitment issues that focused on HBCUs were being developed and implemented before being separated from the company. However, we're not really sure whether these programs that were initially launched in the 20-teens were ultimately successful. As from my reading, the resources that were dedicated to them have largely been reallocated to other diversity issues, which speaks to a changing interpretation of what the issue is. Regardless of their success, whether they're successful or not, these programs and this common language of a pipeline program, even with all of its shortcomings, which include a critical lack of introspection and a failure of accountability on the part of hiring agents, was very influential. And I would even say that it impacted how I approached the idea of supporting data services and creating data education as a librarian and a program developer. I think this idea of critical rupture in the pipeline has also been a significant driver of how universities have been reshaping their curriculum. And that's the perspective that I want to take a look at. So it's become abundantly clear that moving into the University of Oregon, it was abundantly clear that data services was going to be a big part of the library's future. And it didn't matter whether it was going to be a standalone program in the libraries or whether it was going to be something that was more holistically fit into an existing program. The university had made a big push. It made a really big push into data-focused future and created instances like the president's data science initiative to signal that change to the wider university. And I would say that my employer at that time was no different than many other universities. This graphic here takes a look at the growing number of data science programs that really, I would say, took off. It looks like really around 2014, 2015, the same time that Google was doing their work to recruit more people of color into their engineering tracks, right? So my university was no different, I don't think significantly different than any other space. And the program was really designed around a perceived broader pipeline issue. The discussions that were prevalent were sort of an industry focused, one that was focused on supplying industry with the students or the workers that they needed, and not necessarily addressing a whole data competency model. And from my perspective, in the libraries, I was really curious about how we could be a participant in that model, how we can meet that need. And I was really concerned about what I was reading in the literature, knowing that the university was making this change, but also knowing that as this was happening, minoritized or equity deserving communities were often left out of the program. So I was really concerned about how we could actually build one that had equity, an idea about equity at its center. Additionally, this graphic that I put on the board had I had a feeling that when there was going to be a big shift that was signaled by a multidisciplinary change to focus on data education, that there will be a lot of new courses across the curriculum. And so we did a catalog search of all the classes that were related to data in some capacity, research design, research, or visualization. And what we found was there was not really any unit on that campus that wasn't exploring data in some way, shape, or form. However, we noticed that a lot of these programs did not have a support network because it was a new undertaking. It was experimental courses, and there was no universal support for data or data education on the campus. And so those were the parameters that really guided what I wanted to do in building that program at the university. So how did we do this? One of the ways that we did it with the idea of having equity in mind and building within a framework to supply that pipeline is something that I now look back on and say was probably a little incongruous with that goal. Is I built a 1 credit course in data competencies around research data management and records research records management. The idea was, in conversations with researching faculty, felt that they did not feel comfortable in hiring students into their labs or bringing them into their courses because they didn't have a foundational, did not have a strong foundation in research data or research data management. So we decided we wanted to build a system that someone could translate a skill that they were building, that they were bringing, have it visibly on their transcripts to show to potential employers, whether it's a research lab on campus or it was after they left the university, because their decision about student success could mean something totally different than what I was thinking about. But of course, we built this. We had to put some parameters on it, and so we limited it to STEM students because the infrastructure would not allow it to be targeted to, I think, more than 10 disciplines at the time. I would say for what the program was designed to do, it was very successful. But I noticed that there were a lot of people who did not have an opportunity to participate. So seeing the limitations that coming from the libraries that we had in building a credit-bearing course that would actually only allow a small group of students to actually participate, we changed our track a little bit to focus on, at one point, I challenged my colleagues for us to be the largest supplier of non-credit bearing education on the campus. And so how did we do that? We took a probably more traditional library approach to doing training and workshops. We set up a really robust non-credit bearing education portfolio. Recognizing that 1 credit costs money and may slow someone's time to completion, but understanding that we were potentially trading in some sort of credential that they could have leveraged in another way. We began looking for what had the greatest currency in the education community at the time, and that certainly seemed like it was the carpentries that was relatable to folks and that we felt we could share with partners. And so we built a curriculum around that. We also built a curriculum around an industry standard in the R platform, and using Tidyverse to also build a platform, because we felt that was translatable both to students who wanted to have undergraduate and graduate research opportunities, but also for people who were leaving the university. It was an industry standard. In addition to building that sort of program, we decided that we wanted to have greater representation about who was teaching courses. Recognizing that we wanted to have greater ethnic diversity and support greater ethnic diversity, gender diversity, and discipline diversity, we built out a peer network, a peer training and consultation network that sought to have people from different ethnic backgrounds, discipline backgrounds, and actually degree backgrounds. So not only PhD students, but also master students, and hopefully at some point undergraduate students, to serve those roles, to hopefully bring down the intimidation factor in seeking out help. Those students, I will say, took on a lot of responsibility in building out our programs. They taught courses, they did one-on-one consultations, they developed unique curriculum, they observed their communities and built a responsive curriculum, which is how we ended up with offering an entire Tidyverse series in Chinese. And because of the success of that program, we started exploring building a Tidyverse series in Spanish. But of course, then the pandemic hit and everything changed. We were affected financially. The university decided to pivot and our partnership with the graduate school to support those graduate teaching fellows evaporated, as they were all pulled into PhD only academic departments, not academic/administrative departments. And so that program was cut. So there was an infrastructure loss. But I will say that building out the program and developing the curriculum and making that as readily available for self-directed learning as well as directed learning allowed us to continue to offer those courses, even if we could not offer them at the same scale as before. But you'll note that everything that I've talked about is about building capacity for the pipeline. In my current context, I don't have that same on the ground perspective, but my colleagues here at the at Columbia have built a really successful program that is, I think, working on the pipeline program just with a slightly different spin. And that's through the building the foundations for research computing, which was focused on providing a central space for graduate students and postdoctoral scholars to cultivate essential computational skills, regardless of their discipline. So building a disciplinary community around these sort of methods. And that's been extremely successful, extremely oversubscribed. But again, it's looking at addressing a pipeline issue. So with my own individual work on a program addressing a pipeline issue, looking at the work that other institutions are doing, because I know that we're not unique. I've talked to other data librarians across the country about this, or are doing this work with a pipeline mentality, with private industry building these pipelines. Why are we still asking the question? Why, why is there a question of lack of diversity in tech careers? And so we should ask ourselves, is it a question of infrastructure? Is it a question of a pipeline? Or is it a question of culture that permeates higher education, industry, and society? Or is it some combination of all of those? I pulled this quote because I think this starts to help us reframe that pipeline question. This is taken from that Washington Post article that I spoke about earlier. There's a set of biases, I am quoting, there's a set of biases that underline both the pipeline problem and a tech culture problem. If you just look at who has access to computer science education, it's very skewed by income. And that's a big part of that pipeline issue. Additionally, if you look at on the other side of culture, you have this mentality that many companies, they only hire from Stanford or MIT and don't do campus recruiting at women's colleges or historically Black colleges. There's a bias there. And so it's a pretty complex issue that I think we have to address, and that I personally was not addressing and when I was looking at it. The main thing was providing a way for people to get access to the pipeline. And I think that mentality was driven by a sense of urgency, certainly, but also an idea of having a greater quantity rather than having a quality of a program that's preparing people more holistically to participate. Speaking to that culture issue, I'm taking from that article again, resume screeners and sourcers were screening out kids left and right because they didn't know HBCU school names or what Divine Nine fraternities or sorority meant. And so this points to these cultural issues that are baked into this process of even that recruitment. And so that tells me that that's not actually a pipeline issue, but it's a cultural issue that we actually need to address. And I was left with the question, are we in libraries in the position to even be advocates on our campus when parallel societies play out into a mission to the programs that focus on data science and data analysis? And so that's a question that I would like for us all to engage with in the question and answer portion today. So what tools do we in the libraries have to address formal structures and informal practices that impact the access for equity deserving communities? Well, one of the things that I like to think in reframing how I want to approach data education moving forward is leverage some of our traditional strengths inside the libraries. Borrowing from Eric Klinenberg, I like the idea of the libraries being social infrastructure, being a place or an organization that shapes the way people interact. And I would say the way that people interact with a superstructure like higher education. The library has a really unique space to fill with that. And I think embracing the idea of us as social infrastructure can inform our practice around data education. It also led me to think about the work of Roa Benjamin and this concept of moving slower to empower people. I would say that one of the reasons that I question, and I think that several people are questioning the success of some of these initiatives, are the concentration was not necessarily on empowering people, but rather getting the largest number of people ready to apply to a pipeline. So what can we do to be more deliberate and empower people? And does that change our entire frame of reference in this work? So as I was thinking through this problem, I've been thinking, trying to develop a framework or find a framework that I could hold on to. And I'm going to try out Eric Liu's framework around understanding power, the laws of power, and the rules of action. I am trying it out. Maybe I will move somewhere else later, but that's where I am right now. So when thinking on the questions of data and agency and how do we address a lack of diversity in tech careers, I was really drawn to the parallels of thinking about power and power structures that not only are representative in the platforms themselves, but actually in the language of how we are discussing the shortcomings of those those corporations to recruit into their companies or into our programs to actually recruit into our actual programs. There's such a, while this framework talks about politics and a severe inequality that crops up in politics, I think the same thing holds true. Maybe not in a one-to-one, but in broad strokes, it holds true in this sort of discussion. And so what I thought was really useful was the argument that one, we should be reframing the problem. The broad problem is there's a lack of diversity, but the problem is not that there are not enough qualified people to participate, that their education isn't good enough, but rather that there is something inherent in the system of recruitment, hiring, development, and retention for equity deserving communities that causes this problem. And we can see that even as industry are recruiting more, for example, in the 2021 Google Diversity Annual Report, their retention is suffering. So there's something else that we really need to think about there. I really want us to reframe the problem from one of we need to build more. I want to move away from building pipelines because the pipeline is a problem to one that's empowering people to actually reframe the narrative, both for us, but also reframing to challenge both our administrators on campus as well as our partners in tech to say, actually, it's not that their people don't have skills, but rather we need to think about what is the environment that we're building for people. And actually, what do we want? What are the actual skills that we need for people to participate in this? And so I don't think that from my vantage point, we necessarily have all the advantages to make that direct impact on the pipeline. We do have an ability to have a direct impact on data education and building out the competencies that actually prepare students, whether they are in STEM fields, humanities, or social sciences, so that those students can make an argument that they are conversant and able to actually work in these spaces. They don't need to be reshaped just to be in the spaces. So I centered my language around change rather than attacking strategies, because I thought change is actually what we want to do. And that change from just driving people to the pipeline to building sort of easy, attainable ways for people to access the skills to actually confront the broader problem is what I want data education to look like moving forward. We are not alone in any way, shape, or form in thinking about reframing the narrative. And I wanted to pull some of the an example of Sophia Noble's Equity Engine is doing the work right now. And this quote really struck me, and I want to use this to start to close close my talk today, where she says, when Black women are given the runway of time, resources, and networks of power, we often expand opportunity exponentially for others. And I thought this was really resonant because this is a great example of how the actual problem is the same, but the actual problem statement was reframed. They identified the pipeline not being the problem, but all the hidden infrastructure that is built to provide success for the hidden success for the majority group, but made inaccessible universally for other communities. So the question becomes, where do we go from here? What does this mean for libraries? In what ways can we in the library use our skills, our position as a center point of campus, as a trusted partner in education, as an interdisciplinary space? People who are already invested in digital and information literacy competencies to support equity deserving communities. How can we use our position as social infrastructure, as campus centers, and even community centers when we think of library spaces beyond the campus to address these issues inside systems and provide safer spaces for learning? I think these are the key questions that we have to start to grapple with as we start to reframe data education moving forward. So with that, I just want to close and say thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I honestly don't know about everyone else, but I'm absolutely feeling energized and challenged by this presentation and your thoughts. And thank you so much for sharing. I know you said this is a work in progress, but I think the care and intentionality that you put into it, I'm floored. It's really, we're really lucky that you were able to share this with us. We are going to take a pause right now for 10 minutes, and we're going to reflect and provide some space for you all to formulate some questions. And again, as you reflect, I want to remind us about just sort of being respectful and thoughtful when engaging in this Q&A. At the 10-minute mark, you can kind of raise hands, use the virtual hand, and kind of queue up to ask questions, and then also absolutely take advantage of the chat. And maybe because I know people are also kind of using the chat to kind of just add conversation and thoughts. If you have a question, why don't you put sort of indicate that it's a question in the chat somehow. Maybe put question and then put in your question so we can kind of pull those out a bit easier. So again, Jonathan, thank you. And we'll kind of, maybe we'll take 5 minutes because we're at 10:18 and I kind of noticed that. Is that okay if we do 5 minutes so we kind of actually have a little bit of time, a little bit more time for questions?
Sure, but we have till the hour.
Oh, right, sorry. We'll take the full 10. I think
we've got a good half hour. So I think we're still in great shape. Yep. Is that right?
Thank you. Yes.
That's my memory. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. So so I'm going to set the timer and we'll bring everybody back in 10 minutes. So we are back now, and I think for this Q&A part, again, please feel free to drop in your questions into the chat. For those of you who are willing to just ask your question, go ahead and raise your virtual hand, and maybe we can kind of alternate between the virtual hands and the chat part. But and I think Angela and Justin, if you can help me out if I miss anything in the chat, please help out. But I did see a first question from Todd Quinn. And the question I might ask to sort of clarify this question is, what impact does the librarian's demographic, lack of diversity, impact these inclusive ideas of data education? And I might even sort of ask, and maybe this could be asked or answered in both ways, sort of individual librarians, and then as an organization, maybe even in terms of diversity or background.
It's a really, really good question. And as I was sitting with this topic and trying to draw out some of those questions, I was thinking about our 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 very same issue, right? And so much of the language that we are dealing with is we're building all these pipeline programs to get people of color into librarianship roles, or the profession of librarianship. And so I think on that level, it has some real impact. I also think that equity deserving groups are pretty underrepresented in the specialized data roles, and I think that that does play a part. I don't really have a great answer for that. I think part of the work that we were doing at Oregon, and I think some of the work that I want to continue now, is in reaching out to people outside the library for peer roles, was about getting greater representation, diverse representation in the program. I think part of what another thing that I think, and my colleagues at Oregon, some of who I see are on the line, are continuing to do. We're building data specific or digital skills specific programs. I mean, internships, right? Like that was one of our goals, to do that. And making sure we were very intentional in our recruitment, to say, BIPOC folks are, strongly encouraged to apply. We were recruiting for that as well. That to use language that I'm not sure I'm necessarily comfortable with. Have some sort of diverse background, adding to our definitely our community, but also hopefully being able to use our position as a research institution, doing work that other libraries would look at and value, and hopefully help that student be to progress in their career, using that as a part of their flight path. So it's a really good question. It's one that I think has a lot of answers, and I don't necessarily have a ton of them. There's all these approaches that frame how I think about building a program, one that's public serving, but also one that serves our profession. I've talked about it with my UL quite a bit since I've been here.
Thank you. We have another question. This one's from Eric. And so as you've been developing new programs, have you also been considering any new approaches to marketing services or outreach on campus to reach a wider group of students?
Definitely. We did, I think it's a continuous battle. Let me step back. It's a trial battle. Is wrong language. It's a trial constantly to build outreach initiatives. Starting with the basic web presence and direct appeal to personal relationships that you have on campus and in your communities. I think we have done things such as printing out takeaway cards, like it's at a gallery, and sticking them in every single mailbox in key departments. Leverage people's personal relationships from our student core. I think I'm going to say this because they are on the call right now, Gabrielle. leveraged my colleagues' expertise and notoriety to get publications about them, to talk about our services, was I think something that I think had a tremendous impact as well. And as I have moved into this new position, I've been thinking about that a lot, as well as we have a dedicated a communication team, and thinking and really rethinking at a really distributed campus, what does it mean to reach key demographics? And I think I should take a step back and say that is actually what was most important to us, was reaching key demographics, not having blanket coverage. And I think if that is a metric for success, then we were successful in that. And I think it's probably more impactful to do that work that way anyway.
Great, thank you. I'm going to give a minute or so for maybe some other questions for anybody, if you want to type it in or raise your hand.
You see Justin's hand.
Oh, yes, Justin, please.
Great, thanks, Andy. And I just want to start by thanking you so much, Jonathan. That was such an amazing talk, and I really appreciated the way you sort of explain the kind of the history and context of your own thinking and how it's evolved. There's so much to think through with everything that you said. So just 1,000 times thank you. And one of the things you said right at the beginning sort of stuck with me through your entire talk, and that was, you sort of mentioned that you were self-trained as you kind of moved from government information to doing more data-based work. And so this is a really open-ended question, so I'll let you take it any direction that you want. But I think, so many of us were sort of self-trained as we became data librarians. And I'm just curious to sort of hear you reflect on sort of the relationship between this kind of self-training and maybe the rise of these programs that are more kind of formalized and these sorts of things in terms of training people, and how that sort of shifts questions of access and empowerment for better or for worse, and the power structures involved, both the internal to the sort of the community and communities that that are within libraries, but also then the community and communities of students that we're training. If that question makes sense, and I'm just really curious about sort of your own experience being self-trained and how it relates to a lot of these structures.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. It makes tons of sense, and I'll ask you to rein me in if I start to spiral, because I'm a bit of a talker with these sort of things. But and thank you for your kind comments about my talk too. I really appreciate that. Being self-trained, I think, was really important to me. And I think it was something that I talked about a lot in building out the service, being self-trained, being coming from a background that was initially focused on humanities and then moving into social sciences, and saying the reason that I came into this in any way, shape, or form was actually because it became relevant in my work. First, as a graduate student, like started playing with it. But then really professionally, as I started to see a variety of, ways that it would be really beneficial for me to actually execute my work. For me, I was really fortunate that, one, I had a problem that I thought I could solve by this tool. Two, I was working in a space that had access to the sort of materials that would allow me to piece together some form of self-education on this topic. And three, I had a position that gave me the space to actually explore, to do that work. And those are really generous conditions to be in, to actually build out that. And that's just not a reality for a lot of us, right? Like, had I been where I was at Hunter at this exact time, I probably would not have been able to build that competency because of the demands being very different. And so, you know, I totally appreciate having the space and the time to do it and to have this self-directed learning, but also acknowledge that the growth of programs like this are really important, right? These more semi-structured or semi-formalized experiences, because one, there's a cohort or a community that someone is tapped into. Two, for good or for ill, there is a validation in being a part of this sort of program that gives people the space to actually pursue this work. That just saying, I'm going to spend 3 hours at my desk trying to figure out this coding problem, when that is not your primary job, may not be looked upon favorably by someone's supervisor. And so it starts to build out space for people to pursue this. And three, I think the more of these that exist, I'm making a possibly erroneous assumption that most of us are in academic spaces. I know all of us aren't, so my apologies, but I think this extends beyond those as well. These provide some sort of credential in some way, shape, or form. They're attached to the larger structure that the university respects, and that is really helpful in translating that discussion, right? Like, I taught myself the basics of R, but I also went out and got certified instructor with the carpentries, and I started this new position in January, and literally every conversation that I went in with faculty members or administrators that were around research or something akin to research, someone would mention that I was carpentry certified, and instantly that gave me a credibility to be in that sort of space. So there's a lot of value in that. I think, the self-education component was important because it helped me to appreciate what are some of the challenges that are being faced by our learners whose programs don't support that, or who live in a community, are just our community members who aren't necessarily in a program and don't have that support network. And it really directly informed how I thought about program formation and what the goals of that program were going to be. So hopefully that addresses what you're asking.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to put in another question from, this one's from Devin. And this is sort of, I think in part, you kind of answered some of this in terms of sort of being really intentional, even with who you hire and who you're kind of trying to invite to teach visualization workshops. But building on the idea of instructor demographic and its effect on student empowerment, do you have maybe other suggestions for how those of us who teach visualization workshops can train up folks who can replace us as instructors for marginalized groups in our community?
I mean, I think, first, thank you for the question. I think that is something that is it's always a really challenging thing, and it's really contextual. I'm really, I don't know, I have focused historically on trying to bring as many different voices into the discussion as possible. And I'm a big advocate for building sort of peer infrastructure, right? Like peer relationships. I think it works really well. One, in having people seek out help from someone, but I think it also does a good job of building on another generation or a different community that wasn't tied into your program before, right? We, in our peer program, we got a tremendous amount of guidance and energy and insight from our peer consultants, instructors. Like I said, they did a phenomenal amount of work in building out the curriculum and recruiting people and making themselves available. I think but what we also did was give a credential, so to speak, with the university name, and hopefully help progress that core onto their next project or next level, whatever they're going to do. So I think that is one of those sort of things, is looking for ways to bring in people from the communities that you want to reach into your program. That can be challenging. And it may take more time and more energy to get that done. I also think that it's really important to compensate those people, because equity deserving groups are generally undercompensated anyway, and we shouldn't seek to sort of address that problem as we can, rather than relying on it. But I understand for a lot of budgets that complicates things. So you have to think about other ways of addressing compensation, or doing, holding really firm and advocating for that as well. Beyond that, I'm not sure. I think forming partnerships outside of your department or the libraries or even your campus is actually something that's a really interesting model that I've seen other people employ, and something that I would like to employ and figure out a way to do it. I think a lot of campuses, a lot of universities are looking for ways of fostering greater interactions with their communities that surround their spaces. And I think forming those sort of partnerships is really important as well. We certainly did that early on when we paired with a local data journalist to teach our actual first workshop. But you can be far more expansive than that, I think.
Thank you. I see Gabrielle has their hand raised, so please.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much. You're amazing. And I'm going to go back and listen to the talk itself. I had a meeting that I could not miss. I think I was thinking a lot about that first question about diversity in leadership, because, now the people who are remaining are all white, myself and my colleague. And I think it requires a certain amount of active self-awareness and explicitness, right? I keep thinking about the difference between the way that Obama talked about race and the way that Hillary Clinton talked about race in her election, right? That she had to say really explicitly, like, I'm gonna care about race. And Obama could say a lot of things that were like centrist and calming sounding and just like show up and appear. And people made certain assumptions about the safety of the spaces that he was in. And so I think that dynamic is just true. And it makes it even more important to do that explicit and targeted outreach and sort of say with your words and also with your actions, over time to kind of demonstrate that. So I don't know how good a job we're doing, but that's the goal.
Thank you. Just so you know, Gabrielle is my colleague from the University of Oregon, and I'm sure you're actually doing a fabulous job of driving that program. So thank you very much doing that work.
Thank you. I want to make sure that that we put in one of Emma Slayton's questions. She had several, and I'm so glad she actually went back and kind of picked one out. And this is the one that I was going to kind of bubble out anyway. So the question here is, what systems for evaluating student learning over longer periods of time have you used, and how do these systems help you to better help people enter and stay in the pipeline long-term? Have you noticed big differences in students who learn on their own or in a course? This is something I think a lot of us are interested in, sort of kind of evaluating how to best teach and engage with students.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you, Emma. And, you know, a question I don't have a great answer for, right? I think a lot of the efforts that we made around evaluation. All right, so first with my the formal course, we had pretty standard methods of evaluation, which were, you know, basically competency tests, right? Hands-on exercises, quizzes, etc. But that took the theoretical frameworks that we were trying to build and put them into actual actual practice. And in order to actually complete the course, you actually had to travel along a research data cycle with a data set from raw to actual published with a DOI in our repository, right? Like, that's how we were able to track that. And it was easy because it's a smaller group and it was in a contained environment with really explicit set of goals from one end to another. When we made this really holistic change to, and this challenge to be the largest provider of non-credit bearing education on campus, for example, which was my goal for my unit, for that unit, metrics became really, really difficult to even conceptualize, right? Because even we were finding if people, even for our introduction to R, for example, people were coming in with all different levels of knowledge. People were actively using it in a research project now to someone who didn't have it installed or know how to install. So how do you devise a metric to see how successful someone is? And I think we started to rely, or at least I, for my own sake, started to rely on soft metrics. And what those were effectively, we set almost nothing up as a one-off. Rather, we put things in as a series. And we were able, I looked at it to see, you know, how many people went from point to point in the series. And I think that was important for me because, yes, people will come in and come out based on what they needed, but you were building a pipeline to what we saw as a complete skill. And if somebody went through that whole cycle, I felt relatively comfortable that they had a complete introductory skill to a particular thing. I mean, we did pre-tests, we did post-tests, but I don't know how comfortable I would say that I would feel in saying that's validation. But I like that other metric more. Same thing here. We do the same thing with foundations right now, pre-test and post-test. I think what I'm very interested in are the people who attend workshops and then participate in those community functions after the fact. I think that's something interesting to do. But I really think I need to do more work in engaging with instructional designers about thinking about how do we do assessment long-term for really diverse communities. And I don't have a great answer for that yet.
Thank you. That was really great. I want to, again, maybe kind of offer a chance for anybody to raise a hand and ask a question that way before I go back into the chat. Another question, and this is actually really interesting, and maybe we can kind of expand on it. One of the questions from the audience is about, they work at a small private undergraduate college library. And what should librarians who work with undergraduate students be sort of doing? What kind of focuses do you see there? And maybe to open it up, do you see sort of differences between sort of, small private, larger public? Like, are there, like, what kind of differences do you see playing out in different organizations?
Yeah. So I definitely see differences, and that's part of the reason that I took a moment to talk about where I've worked before, because I think they've been fairly different. Like, a large urban private, a large urban public, a large R1 out on the West Coast, into a very large private again, research focused private. And I think they're all very different. And I do think there are differences between undergraduate and graduate communities. But I think those are highly contextual and based on where you're at. I think a lot of the work that I did at Oregon was really focusing on undergraduates, but because that shift was relatively new. I think the data science initiative was started in 2017 at the university, that there were no shortage of graduate students from all these other disciplines that did not have the same skill. They were missing the same skills as undergraduate communities were missing. And so I think in that respect that it made it a little bit easier. I would say at spaces that have undergraduate and graduate communities, understanding what is the narrative about where service is owed between undergraduates and graduates becomes an issue. And navigating that to build the program that you want to build is really important. There are places that say, we are an undergraduate serving community, and there's others that say we are a graduate serving community because they are the researchers and the future faculty members. And that's a reality, and it's a stark one, and it's a challenging one, but it's one that you have to identify and shape a narrative for the program that you want to drive. Because I think, other than tradition, a lot of the skills are very transferable across the board. So it's not necessarily a question about skill or approach. I think, like so many of the other things that we've talked about this morning / afternoon, there are all the social contexts that go around it that you have to navigate, all the political realities that you have to navigate, and reframe conversations to be successful in what you want to do. I think one of the things that I talk a lot about with my colleagues is it's okay to be opinionated about the program you want to deliver. You're the program former and the driver, and you should keep that in mind as you're thinking about what communities you're serving.
That is really excellent. This is, one, Jonathan, thank you so much for being so generous and thoughtful in this Q&A. Thank you, everybody, for really, thoughtful, engaging questions. This was a fantastic experience, I think, for everyone. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this concludes our keynote for today. We're going to have a 30-minute break, I think, now. And we're going to be coming back for Unconference, where I actually hope, I know that a lot of the things we've been talking about here, I think are going to find their way into that Unconference, to some of those unconference sessions around data visualization services, instruction, tools, and learning. We will see you in 30 minutes or so.